A week had gone by, and following the worst hangover Osrith had ever experienced, she resolved to do the duty she had been given by King Alfred. Mornings, up and fighting practice with Edward, and when he had been called to be with his father, before Echterd's duty, she had gone to the chapel. Kneeling, close-eyed, praying, or at least thinking about her sister-in-law as people got up, knelt, or sat, praying too, made her feel a little steadier. But Osrith was none happier. She had heard that Uhtred had recovered Gisla's body and committed it to a funeral pyre the day afterwards. But he was insisting on carrying on with his duties. That morning, Bicka had sat beside her. Osrith had only noticed him when he had coughed, politely, near her ear, and she brought her face round to his. Then, wished she hadn't. "I heard you fought with your brother," he began, with his usual directness. "I have no brother," Osrith said, and saw the pain flash over Bicka's face. "Do not say that," he told her, pitifully. But Osrith was not in the mood for coercion. "I choose to say it, because I will not be forced into it, nor forced to stay in Winchester, if this is your plan." Bicka looked at her, and refused to break his gaze. "It was not my doing that the king took you from the Mercen Guard, though will not deny I am pleased you are close to us," he replied. And his look became one of astonishment, as Osrith stood up and left him behind, in the seats near the back of the chapel, without a word, to guard the Atheling. That night, Osrith remembered sleeping by the door as Edward, brooding about his forthcoming wedding, went to sleep in his own bed. Osrith had resisted the Atheling up till then, and she was far in her own misery to be wanting to orgasm. Not even Finan's face in her mind, which usually did for her after her fingers encouraged her clitoris into action, had stirred up any desire for her to wank herself. However, it was not the floor Osrith found herself on the next morning. Strong arms were enveloping her, and she thought muzzily about the circumstances in which she found herself, with only her shirt and Dirk's hair jewel on. It had begun with Edward trying to compel her to talk about her sadness and telling her she was not herself, and had continued with limbs and mouths and a hard-on and sucking and hot, wet fucking. Now, morning, and Osrith knew she would need her lily root, just to make sure, and this was back in her room. Once she got it, she could return to the kitchen and steep it in hot water, before getting on with the day, and she wriggled into her clothing before closing the door behind her. Slipping under the kitchen window, then around to the stables, Osrith's foot pressed on the wall as she leapt into Foregate Street, the quickest route to her lodging near the marketplace. Was she being followed? Ethelwold has found her the last time she was at the palace. Had he found her now, determined to do the same? Osrith trod the stable yard with only the briefest of glances towards where the horses were sleeping. Soon, it had to be soon, and she would go to Hampton and find Ulf and Gert, show them more wealth than they had ever seen in their lifetimes, and return to Alba. The first time, he had pinned her against the wall of the postern doorway, pushing a hand past her hips while holding her hands above her head, a satisfied laugh passing his lips as his fingers became covered in Osrith's and cousin's cum. He had begun to kiss her, that had been his mistake, for Osrith kneed him in the crotch. The second time, he had pursued her across the stable-yard, but had not caught up with her. She had learned to time her egress from Edward's room after that, and from then on had evaded him. And yet, Ethelwold. Last time Osrith had seen him he had not challenged her. He was different. His manner had been cryptic, mystifying. He had looked at her strangely rather than accuse her of Gisla's death. Apart from a few insults, he had said little to her. He had not even been to the training to idle his time away shouting vacuous comments to the warriors. So, on that particular morning, Osrith seemed not to be terrorized by Ethelwold. However, she was impeded by someone. As she leapt the palace wall her trajectory was terrible as strong hands groped her waists. One had a rather ugly bite mark on it. Osrith looked up into the triumphant face of Uhtred's man, the Irishman, Finan. Osrith struggled, but he pressed her body with his to the palisade wall. "I think we have a score to settle." Osrith pushed him aside, angry that her thoughts, and her way, had been interrupted. "I am on my way home, I do not seek trouble." But Finan was not letting go of her arm. "Well, You are making trouble. Looking after the Etheling like that. Osroth felt her body stiffen. But she stared Finan down. He nodded in the direction of the window from which Osrith knew Edward would be watching her leave. Like what? Like that, overnight. He is no boy now? Osrith said nothing as she turned to go, but then turned back. I swore an oath, apparently, to Wessex. And the Etheling commanded that I guard him last night. She saw Finan roll his eyes. Guard him? Is that what you Weans are calling it these days? Like it's any of your business. You know he is married, he said, accusingly. To be married. Yes, Osrith corrected him, to the official line, anyway. Rumour had it that Uhtred, so therefore Finan too, had witnessed the marriage of Edward to Ecgwin, and paid for the priest who carried out the ceremony to live protected, secretly. As are you said so to Uhtred, once, when I sat upon my brother's house. And I, come to think of it, Osrith thought, but pushed Guthred's face from her mind so that her memory of Tagd could fill its place, and became more determined than ever to reach Alban now, and leave this wretched Wessex behind. Tagd. The year and the day were long gone, and the fact that they weren't together for a lot of that yet implied what they always knew, hand-fasted under the summer sun, will not make it to a year and one. But, perhaps, the Morrigan could have been appeased. Then again, it may have been her will to place him where his deep sense of honor meant he had no choice but to attempt to rescue those people in the burning church. And Guthred, well, it had been Constantine's idea, ultimately. Osrith knew that now, the church records had it as such. And perversely, this now made her both sister-in-law and sister to Uhtred, for Guthred was Gisla's brother. Osrith imagined for a moment the look on Uhtred's face if only he knew. Osrith's mind came back to the present. Finan's hands were still around her wrists and he was holding her tightly. She would give to fight. He was agile, as much as Osrith was. She did not want to fight him, she wanted to kiss him. And then Finan let go his grip, stepping back from her and glanced to the flagstones, his head hanging a little. What had happened? I am, so, Finan replied, and Osrith, to her horror, realized she must have said that aloud to him. Married. Or I was. The Lord in his infinite wisdom chose to part me from my good wife last winter, he explained, and a sadness took over his features. Osrith stepped past him, for she knew if she did stay, something she would regret would happen, and there were plenty of candidates for that role. But then she stopped, and reached out a hand. You are Uhtred's man, Osrith restrained herself from saying, hound, for he was not a blind instruction follower like some warriors bonded to lords. Why am I even talking to you? She added, more to herself than anything. Finan turned his head. Because you like my sense of humor, he said, giving her a slight hint of a smile. I do like your sense of humor, Osrith conceded, then strode away, without looking back. North, then, Osrith thought. To Constantine and King Domnall and the wide Moray Firth and the green lands of Alba. And Pitland, and Dunedin where all northern tongues mixed freely. To where she had welcome. And she now had silver to live a life away from Uhtred Ragnarsson, to buy her a place beside the people she cared for most in the world. Her brother's silver, or at least, that stolen in battle. And, if she had to be married to someone, it was infinitely better to be married to a distant Danish king in a land that was her birthright though her mother. Besides, when Domnall saw the wealth she had brought to him, she may well be free of the so-called marriage to the so-called king of Hallyworthland. It might be enough for her to be a warrior in perpetuity. She was not a maid, Constantine had seen to that when she was 12. So wealth it had to be. That Uhtred had aligned himself with the Danes not the Saxons, apart from his desire to claim Bibbenberg, he rejected his family. Osrith massaged her hand which had been hit square on with the arrow. She was sure she had seen the man who had fired it give a triumphant look as she continued to row to Lindisfarne, all those years ago, remembered the gleam of delight in his eyes. Osrith had decided then, as the Holy Island was in sight, that she was going to find Uhtred and, well, here she was, and here she had. She had taken so much trouble to find her brother. And now, Osrith thought, She was taking a deal of trouble to leave Uhtred behind her again. "I'll see you around then." Osrith turned, and saw that Finan was still watching her. And Osrith turned, and nodded. "See you around," she called, and meant it. For it would not be long before Osrith would not see Finan around, and when she did not, she knew she would feel nothing but regret. And the next morning was the same. Osrith felt sore after Edward's attentions, and she had just had a wash in the spring at the back of the kitchens, which had soothed her soreness. He has been vigorous, and Osrith had encouraged him, for while she fucked the Atheling, the vacuum that hung about her heart was temporarily filled. But she needed her lily root again, and was just wondering whether she would be back in time before meeting the Atheling for training when a movement out of the corner of her eye made her jump and, automatically, Bué was out and up. "Oh Finan," she breathed, seeing that it was someone she recognized. Guarding the Atheling, again. He looked at the point of her sword, inches from his face. "It pays. And you need to go back to your home?" Finan looked beyond Osrith. She was indeed going in the direction of Eastgate. "Evidently. Or I would be walking around Winchester for my health." She lowered Bué. Why was he wandering around the city in the early hours of the morning? "Why?" he asked. "Why yourself?" Osrith asked. "To give Uhtred space for his grief," he replied. "And I asked first." Osrith felt herself smiling a little. "It's quiet, and I can think." Overhead, starlings were beginning to collect together on the rooftops. Others would be joining them, Osrith supposed. The big assembly of birds, different species congregating at different times, before disappearing over winter, only to reappear in spring. "And Ethelwold won't bother you." And Osrith was drawn to the face of the man who had not caused her any hassle at all the last time she had come across him, his features still mangled from her assault. "He isn't bothering me much at the moment," she replied, but the confidence had gone from her voice. Ethelwold had a way of getting into her mind. "Why do you want to go north?" he asked, as he began to walk next to Osrith. "Why are you following me?" Osrith asked, sharply. "I'm just walking along the road at the same time that you are," he replied, and the sparkle that would melt Osrith's future self flickered in his eyes. "And you want to go north, because?" He rephrased the question as he glanced over her face, at her scar running northeast to southwest down the right-hand side of her face, her short hair, long enough now for Osrith to catch the color of the ends of it in the edge of her vision, catching the morning sunlight. "It is as close to home as I have," Osrith said. She remembered they had had a similar conversation on the night Gisela had died. And a thought occurred to her: why not Mercia? There seemed to be enmity between Ethelred and Alfred, or on Ethelred's part, coveting the Wessex throne as he did. But he may well choose to honor the union of the two kingdoms by holding Osrith to Alfred's oath, and she would end up back in Wessex again. Alba was much more preferable, to Osrith's mind. "I might know a way," Finan said, "but it will depend on Uhtred." Osrith felt her heart sink. How much was her life going to depend on Uhtred? Even her journey back to Alba was going to depend on him? Osrith Lackland, Finan mused. "From nowhere, eh? Yet Alba calls you home?" He said the last sentence in Gaelic, and Osrith felt herself warming to the man. "An army marches north?" Osrith guessed. But her mind cautioned her. Was she prepared to do as Uhtred asked, if he allowed her to go with them north? Finan nodded. "I can pay," Osrith said, the words from her mouth before she could stop herself, and she cursed inwardly. But Finan laughed. "Reimburse the man with his own money? I dare say you won't be the first." But Osrith was thinking aloud. "And that is why you keep looking at him? You know him?" Osrith shook her head. "Know about him, yes. And it's true, his feats are well known. Tell me, is it because of the death of his wife?" Osrith trailed off, and shook her head. "But, I need to travel to Alba overland. It would be the cheapest way, to preserve the most silver for Domnall, to give her case the most strength." "The way guaranteed to get you killed," Finan replied, lowering his voice as Osrith pulled herself up over a low wall, landing easily on the main street. Eastgate was before her. My purpose for being here is over, Osrith concluded. And I need to go home. To her annoyance, Finan strode with her, keeping step with her. She rounded a corner. A cart drove past collecting scraps put out by the peasants of the city. I don't know you would be safe with us. That is a hard thing to be in Eothwick. And that is where the Lord Utid is going? Finan burst into a wide grin. You want to come, knew it. He leaned towards her ear. You called him Lord, he confided. If your purpose were to annoy me, you are achieving it, Osrith replied, picking up speed and reaching towards her door. You can come, but it will be difficult, he warned. Osrith paused her hand on its way to the latch, then turned to the man. I fought against a shield war in Alba, Osrith retorted. My lord killed Ivar Lothbrokson as I fought beside him, killing the man who would kill him. I have no fear. Now that I can believe, Finan replied, as Osrith made to stride past him. She waited for him to leave. But, not only did he not leave, Finan followed her in. Before Osrith could protest, Finan seized her forearms just beyond the doorway. You have to admit, you owe me something for that information. If his intention was blackmail, it evaporated to nothing. Rather than outrage, Osrith crossed her floor and kissed him, a hand either side of his face. She broke off as suddenly as he had pressed her lips to his, but Finan put his hands onto her shoulder. Finan pulled her towards him. It was his turn. It was a good kiss, and Osrith was disappointed it hadn't lasted longer. Why do you want to fight so badly? To be near Utid? Finan asked, as they broke apart. The way you look at him, there is more to it than his reputation. Osrith looked away. I need information at. She paused. Home. My family is now dead. They used to live in a place not far from Bibbenberg. She leaned closer to Finan. I ended up in Alba quite by chance, and a family took me in. I heard your lord was of Bibbenberg, she embroidered, but I did not understand the circumstances. The look on Finan's face told her he didn't believe a word. I have waited a long time in my life to be near him. Her second attempt was not much better, and Finan waited for her to continue. Maybe one day I will tell you, Osrith said, finally. A lover? Osrith shook her head. Not a chance. I dislike him, the arrogant bastard. Finan tilted his head towards her. A jilted lover? And Osrith burst out laughing. He's lost the love of his life, hasn't he? She thought about her brother, laughing at her expense the night Gisela had died. But I know, if anyone can get me through Northumbria, Utid of Bibbenberg can. She dipped her head to Finan. Clues in the name. And that was the end of it. Finan would go, she could take her lily root and tidy herself up, and go about her day. But there was no sign that the Irishman wanted to leave in a hurry. You live here alone? He looked at the tall ceiling, vaulted with rushes to keep in the warmth. I thought you lived at the palace and let the guards pass you round. Osrith's slap would have struck Finan's face with the full might of her arm, but he was anticipating it, and caught her wrist. I'm sorry, he said genially, I was just joking. And, I can get Utid to take you, but it will cost you. Finan went to kiss her again, but Osrith was cross with him and she pushed him towards the door of her room. Touch Dean. She shouted after him, as Constantine had screamed it at Domhnall that night at Glenorchy. You didn't say that earlier. He put a hand to his lips. Thagrain Agam Thursday. No, I will not. But Osrith had bashed the door closed, barring it, and thrust her back to the planks. After a few moments, checking that Finan was not still out there, Osrith crossed to her bed, lying on it, brooding. And closed her eyes. When she opened them again, it was night. A crescent moon was curving in the sky, and horror was settling on her like a miasma. She had missed the whole day. Scrambling to her feet, Osrith pulled at her clothes, trying to make herself tidier. She would go to Steeper, tell him she was ill. No, not ill, that was what they perceived as weakness in a woman. No, delayed. Someone needed her help. No, he would ask why. So, A murmur of noise was infiltrating her ears through the walls outside, and Osrith was momentarily distracted from making up her excuse, and she approached the door. What was causing the disturbance? If it was Aethelwold, and he had discovered where she slept, Osrith would kill him and take the consequences. More noises, and a scraping, and Osrith immediately withdrew away, but was nearly hit in the face as the door was kicked open. She flew at the intruder, struggling as he struggled. Then he stopped, and seized her shoulder. It was Finan. There was rain outside and it had dampened his hair. "Tell me to go," he instructed Osrith. His voice sounded almost as if he were begging, pleading with her as he put two hands on her shoulders, holding her roughly, insistently. Osrith struggled, but he held her fast. "Tell me to go," he repeated, all humor of that morning gone from his voice and from his face. "And I will go, Osrith, I will, if you tell me to." His voice was insistent, forceful, as if desperate for Osrith to believe him. "Is Toili Magus Thamiagi Thursday?" Osrith stared. She felt back in Alba now, back in the lowlands of ever-undulating pastureland, back in the land of the Irian, where she soared with grace at the side of kings, where she was proclaimed one of them. Finan spoke as one of them, and made her forget the suppressive life here in Wessex where she had done what she had set out to do, and find Uhtred, only to find he was as tethered as she felt, like a bird of prey in captivity longing to stretch his wings. And, with this man, the Irish warrior sworn, she felt, at last, freedom. He, not Constantine, nor Domhnall, was who she had known for years. He, Finan of the Allied, had been at the peripherals of her view in Wessex. But now, he was full view, engulfing her world, and Osrith was only too willing to be consumed. "Stay," Osrith said, and almost before she finished saying the word, Finan was kissing her, more insistently, more lovingly than he had done that morning, interlacing his hands into her hair. The kiss was breathtaking, and he was good at it, pressing his lips just firmly enough to make her press her body towards him, and Osrith needed no encouragement to do that. Ever the practical, Finan pushed the door closed, and secured the broken latch with a chair, before pulling Osrith to him, and she caressed his arms, his chest, his body. Soon, his naked chest was before her, and Osrith stroked his back where he had been beaten. She would soon learn of his enslavement, and spend many nights holding him through his nightmares. She would learn that he never gave up the will to leave the Slavers in the same way as Uhtred never had. King Alfred was owed by Uhtred for the rescue attempt, Finan would later tell her. But did it have to be paid with by another oath? Now, though, as Uhtred sat, holed up in his own home waiting to bolt to his brother, in Dunham, having killed a priest for his disparaging comments of Gisela, and dragging Alfred from his hall and holding him at knife point, Finan was here, with Osrith, and he was holding her close, his hands on hers. "Anbilgawil Jagat?" Osrith frowned. "Anbilgli Gagat?" she asked of him. "Unbeg." He looked at her, and smiled. "I cannot tell what it is to hear it," he told her, then pinched eyes with his fingers, sitting on the bed, and hunched over. Osrith put her hand on his shoulder, suspecting a trick. But there was no trick, and Finan pulled her to him, hugging her as if she were an old friend, pulling her down next to him, smoothing her hair through his fingers. "Your hair is like warm gold," he murmured, before kissing her lips. Osrith rolled her eyes. "You want to learn some better lines," she told him. "My lord grew up in Ireland and tried to pull women with that." Something in Finan bridled for a moment, but then he grinned at her. "My lord." He imitated, scoffing at her deference, then drew her up to him, his body close to hers. She smiled, as his hands, as firm and deft as in her imagination, held her, running them down her body, his hands down her sides, then kissed her neck, before returning his fingers to her waist. Osrith bunched up and giggled when Finan tickled her. That night, there was nothing in the world except him and her. "I still need information. Is it necessary for me to be on my back?" she asked, when he had got her virtually naked. Osrith still wore Eric's jewel in her hair. If she had known what electricity was, she might have compared his lips to a heart-jolting million volts as he pulled her body so close to his that she wondered if they would ever be parted. Would you like to be? 88,888,888. And Finan had made love to her with a grace and eagerness that matched her lone imaginings. He made her come. He had been slow and tender, and while they were recovering their strength to love one another again, Finan held her and tickled her and made her laugh. What made Osrith know, in her bones throughout all of her life, that Finan was the man for her was that she had been equal to him, in that she had determined what they did as much as he did. Finan wasn't petulant, like Constantine, nor selfish like Edward. He wanted her for her. They lay arm in arm afterwards and talked. "May I see you again?" Finan asked, as he reluctantly pulled himself off Osrith and groped around to find his clothing. "If Utad can spare you," Osrith replied. "Utad is not my lord," he reminded her, sternly. "But you are bonded." Osrith sat up, her body very much on display, which was unlike her experience with either Constantine or Edward, where she would have been diving for her clothes by now. "You his kinsman. He has lost his wife," she added. "I would like to see you again, Osrith," he said, halfway through putting one leg through his breeches, and Osrith noticed his words had changed slightly. "And I would you, Finan more," she replied, not feeling the flush on her body that she usually felt when men examined her body with their eyes, as Finan was doing now. "More?" he asked, finding the other breeches leg. "Well, that is a boast." But true, Osrith thought. No acorn for the Irishman in his trousers, thank you very much. Her cunt certainly knew the greatness of Finan of the Ulaid. And they pressed their lips to one another and kissed as if the world would stop if they didn't. Osrith was needed at the palace, but she didn't care. But had to say so. Though she took her time over it, and the sun's morning rays were coming stronger through the gaps in the door. "I have to go, I am needed," she said at last, as Finan moved in again to catch her lips with his own. "You are needed," Osrith insisted, her heart overspilling into her mouth, as his cock had done not half an hour before. When she was sure Finan had gone, Osrith shut the door and then made an attempt to find all her clothes. She had agreed to meet Finan, with the money. And to do that, she had to attend the palace. 88,888,888. But Osrith had not even been missed, because of what had happened the night before. Few guards were occupying positions around the palace, which should have been the first clue. The second was that Stipa could not be found. Stipa could never not be found, and it took Osrith a good while to find someone to tell her what had been going on. That person was Aldred, the guard who had insulted Gisela by not letting her pass to Allah, in the British ghetto, and he was standing on the ramparts looking more than a little ill. "Tell me what is happening," Osrith demanded of him, but she didn't have to persuade him to talk very much, for the terrified young man told her everything. About the priest who had called Gisela a Danish whore, of Utad slapping him to the ground and killing him. Of Stipa, who had tried to arrest Utad, but instead the Lord had taken up his Sikhs and dragged the king into the corridor that led to the armory and held the blade to his throat. "He is holed up, they say, in his home," Aldred stuttered, with a ... a witch. A witch, thought Osrith. He must mean that blonde-haired woman who had been with Utad's company. She could not fathom what or who their woman was, only that she was Danish. Possibly a seer? A captive? A witch? All three? And what was Utad doing with her in his company? "They say no one has been able to get him out. She has put a curse on him." The witch. And Aldred went on holding his spear as if his life depended on it, which it probably did. 88,888,888. Osrith took herself down to the kitchens after that, and ate some bread and cheese, removing some boiling water which was going to make the broth, and ground up some of the lily root with tagged Sikhs. Stowing it away with the terebinth and tansy in the lining of her jerkin, Osrith made her way to the chapel. But Bukka was not there, and it would seem that he, too, was outside Utad's house, where the standoff was taking place. When she could not find Edward, not the king or queen, Osrith reasoned she wasn't needed to take the Atheling through sword skill. So, she decided to see Thyra. The house was not far from the palace, well kept, just beyond the two cranes, and no sooner had Osrith knocked than Thyra flung open the door. Clearly, it was not Osrith she was expecting, and her face fell, but she invited Osrith in anyway, offering her goat's milk and a chair. "Does Mayhud Hewitt?" she whispered quietly, thinking of the healer, for she had seen Thyra visit Allah too. And she told her of Gisela, from the door to the Britons, when she returned with the children, and then of the horrific afternoon where Osrith just could not save her life. Throughout, Thyra looked at her sympathetically, and when Osrith had finished, she leaned over the kitchen table and placed her hand over Osrith's. "I know you did the right thing," the Danish woman soothed. "And, inside your heart, Osrith, you must know it too." And she did. Osrith reassured her. But her mind was always flicking back to a thought of Ethelwold, not his words, but his presence. Especially his presence, his silence and reluctance to provoke her. "He is ready to kill anyone," Thyra explained, when Osrith asked about Uhtred, and confirmed what Aldred had told her, about the priest and the insult and the threat to the king. "Don't be too long from us," Thyra urged Osrith, when she got to her feet, and Osrith promised not to be. Although, with what she had in mind, she might be. All day, Osrith roamed the palace, looking for answers. More importantly, she wanted to be seen to be looking, and in the end took up Asgard on the opposite parapet. And from there she saw a crowd of people outside Uhtred's house. And stared. It was true. So how did her brother intend to deal with them? He could only stay in the until he was out of food. So she would need to be ready, if she were going to be going with them. As the autumn sun bent around the horizon, creating long shadows, one of Wessex's guards approached. Osrith recognized him as having been at Beamflout, for he had lost an arm. "Prince Edward has requested your presence," he told her, but did not tell Osrith where. This was her second day not leading his training, and it was important he had some explanation from her. But she found the Etheling in his father's library, poring over some of the manuscripts, a worried expression on his face. Osrith made to explain, but Edward waved his hand at her, then looked back to her, uncertainty on his features. "I have been busy, too busy," he explained, putting aside a paper, then sighing. "My father's expectations of my involvement in state have increased." "As it should be." Osrith nodded, and he gave her a small smile. "And you were." He was no longer a child, Finan had reminded her of this. "Incapacitated. The Lord Uhtred's standoff was concerning, and when I went to find you, and Steeper." But Edward waved her explanation away. "I promised to do better," she concluded. Then, the Etheling got to his feet. "Come, I have something to show you," the prince said, but fell silent as they walked down the corridor to the hall, across it, and into the sleeping corridor. "What?" Osrith asked, when he pushed open his bedroom door. "My wedding clothes," he told her. Osrith's mouth fell open at the sheer luxury of the outfit. Silk and satin and brocade. None of this was insular, all of it must have been traded a good dozen times before reaching Britain. It reminded her of Malmuyer's outfit. "You are going to look magnificent," she told him, without taking her eyes off the jerkin and shirt and breeches. "Look closer," Edward urged, putting her hand on her shoulder, and then pointing into the corner. "What, Edward?" Osrith asked, confused. "I just don't see." There was the dresser, and his table which contained a comb and a mirror. Her distracted mind searched for his meaning, and she turned back round to him. Edward's face was close to hers. Without missing a beat, the Etheling leaned towards her, pressing his lips on hers. Then, he broke away, moving to his bed, and turning away his head. "What is the matter, Edward?" she asked, and was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "People have died to keep me alive," he replied, refusing to look at her. "A child's life was taken, when my father hid in the marshes. All to save my life." His frame shuddered, and still the prince would not look at. All that pressure, thought Osrith, and she sat beside him, placing a hand on his. But he pushed her away. Then he turned back, grasping her shoulders. "Edward," she made to complain. But then he kissed her again, running his hands down her body, ignoring his wedding clothes, as the tips of his fingers left searing marks on her cold skin as he pressed them into her stomach, up her waist, until her breasts were level with his face. He looked at them as a starving man might look at a loaf of bread. Osrith's head knew she should make him stop. She had been with Finan less than 12 hours before, but her body took over at his adept attentions, stroking here, kissing there, listening to her responses and responding to them, enjoying every touch as the Etheling led the way. When, later, he had come in her, Osrith's breasts red from his forceful grip, her cunt hot and nerve-sensitive from his rigorous thrusting, he rolled away, brutally. "Can you tell me?" Osrith began, and he turned to her. And he pulled away the covers that were over her body, shaking a hand away from him. "That is all," he said, and looked away as Osrith dressed. When she had finished, Osrith asked, "Do you wish me to stay or go?" "Go," he said, flatly, turning away from her. But then he was on his feet, his spent cock glistening in the candlelight. "Stay," he then said, his eyes on Osrith, his sunny demeanor back as he wrapped a linen robe around himself. He bent to offer Osrith her cloak. She huddled up in it, and sat beside Edward, on the bed. "I feel the weight of it all, kingship," he confessed, eventually. "You will make a good king," Osrith reassured him. "I am not my father." And he looked plaintively at her. "No," Osrith said, tracing a hand to his face. "You are you, Edward, with as much strategy and intellect and kenning and strength as your father. You would have been him if you'd have lived in the time he had. But you have lived in relative peace. You know what that is like, for all your people, to be able to live without war." She reached up, her touch soft towards his hair. "You have as much to fight for as Alfred did, more so, even." And that caused Edward to draw her close, and he kissed her, holding her gently around the top of her back, as if she were a delicate ornament. "Osrith." He broke away, then kissed her again, and he drew one of her hands to his groin. Already hard, she thought flatly. And it was because Osrith now knew what it was like to Finan, better than she had ever imagined as she did herself solo, that she truly realized what love and sex together were like. This, with Edward, was a mere shadow. He was the Lord Prince, and she was paid for service to him. Shortly afterwards, and it had been quick that time, Osrith dressed. Edward seemed as fascinated with her putting on her clothes as he had been taking them off her again. He made to touch her flattened breasts as Osrith turned to go. "Will you stay?" But Osrith shook her head. "I was to be your guard until your wedding," she reminded him. "Tomorrow, you will be one, with Elflad, your elf beauty." Edward nodded, then leaned into her face, and pressed his lips to hers. "My thanks," he said, looking at her face. "I have never been bothered by Ethelwold since you have been my guard." "I have," thought Osrith, dully, and the same cognitive dissonance reverberated about in his head for a moment, at their last meeting. Edward leant down for another kiss, and Osrith could feel him getting stiff again. So she broke off, and pecked him on the forehead, and left the Priapra Claude Prince to sleep alone that night, as he hoped he would see her tomorrow. Tomorrow, Osrith thought, bitterly, and she made to the kitchens to recover her linen bag, which she had topped up with portable food. Her riding boots and leather jerkin were exactly where she had left them earlier that day. But there would be no tomorrow for Osrith now, not here in Wessex. The horses were sighing softly in their sleep when she unthreaded the leather riding rein from the one she was least likely to fall off. Her well-used cunt stung from its use in the last day, and Osrith's mind was drawn to Constantine. He may be king of Alba by now, that young man, so different to Edward in manner and demeanor, although few monastery records reported in detail on the throne of Alba. Domnall was still king 6 weeks ago, which would have had the lag of 6 months as Alfred's spies got the message from Culdis to Winchester. Constantine's seduction technique was always inextricably linked to Dunnottar. The first night that he had touched her, Constantine told her to do what she was told. She was to lie down, and the prince had run his hands up her thigh to her bottom, pulling on her trousers, then parting her legs, before drawing down her breeze and making his cock disappear inside her. that she was his special servant and she remember to smile. When Osric had refused, the next night, Constantine had locked her out of the palace all night on his room's wind-mauled balcony, refusing to let her in or feed her until she had complied. But he had been a boy then. He would have changed, surely? Married to Mary as he undoubtedly was, now. But then Edward hadn't changed. He had been the sunniest child when Osric had first met him, and had remained so, despite the emergency facing Wessex. It was the trembling Aldred who let Osric pass through the main gate of the palace unchallenged. Why would he go to all that bother again of challenging her? He looked ill still, and Osric guessed that Uhtred might have remembered the young man's insult to Gisela and, if he had not already paid him a visit, Aldred might have reason to expect that he might. And led the horse, its saddlebag containing Uhtred's silver, buried so long ago in the base of one of the stable's posts and stowed cleanly away, right up to Uhtred's house, which was 4 deep in people, 1 row of Uhtred's men, and 3 rows of the palace guards. It was no wonder that there were few palace guards when most of them seemed to be waiting in line, armed, waiting for Uhtred to come out. The challenge was being met by Uhtred's men, who were determined that their lord would not. Osric remembered losing Tagged. She had decided to be a wife to him, hadn't loved him, didn't love anyone then, but was convinced that love would grow from their mutual respect. It was a puddle compared to the ocean of love that Uhtred clearly had felt for Gisela Hearthknut's daughter. All-consuming, as if losing limbs if they were parted. And they were parted by the veil of death, now. Osric looked at the scene again, and looked further on. At the side of the house, horses were tied to a broken railing patched up with a rope. Uhtred's white mare patiently chewing on a hay bale. Hild, the abbess, then pushed past Uhtred's guards, with both of Uhtred's children, one of the older nuns from the monastery carrying a sleeping Sciorra as young Uhtred called out for his father, but was soothed by Hild, her mouth to his ear. And then Finan saw her, giving a grin and a nod of approval, presumably to her choice of horse, which he tempered very quickly down to a curl of the lips, before engaging with Stipa, who had chosen to challenge him again. He made his way over to her, through the throng of people. A good choice. Finan looked approvingly at the small bay horse that Osric was walking beside. You are about to leave. Osric's voice was low, and she had been accurate. The horses had been well fed and their reins were tethered loosely to the bar. No horse would be tied thusly if it was supposed to be there all night. Wait for me, here, in Wessex, so I can find you Mogul, Kimia Rithest, he said to her, touching her forehead with his lips. But if you must go north. He took her scarred HND, and pressed a silver piece into it, closing her fingers around it. This was final, binding. The recipient could not refuse the gift now, and she remembered how she had done the same, when she had given him the last of her coins. Finan then bent his head to Osric and kissed her knee quakingly on the lips before returning to his position outside Uhtred's house. Things began to happen very quickly after that. The house door was flung open and, with the Danish woman in hand, Uhtred bolted for the horses and the rest of the men followed their lord. And they rode to the north gate, which had been cleverly not been guarded. They were being followed by Stipa and the rest of the Mercen guard, making a pointless attempt to chase them. Gripping the coin Finan had given to her, Osric shook her own horse's reins, and she galloped behind them, past the perimeter wall of the palace. No flames, this time, thought Osric, and no honest friend, as she had Weheric Thurgilson, to sit beside. And she chased her brother, the outlaw, out into open Wessex countryside.